Does the field of communication and media studies have an identity crisis? Is this crisis local or global? Does it apply to a particular region or country, or does it seem to pop up, in the many different places around the world where the field has become an important part of the academic infrastructure? About this and many other fascinating topics is this conversation with Sebastin Valenzuela of Pontificia Universidad Católica in Santiago de Chile in this episode of El Café Latinx. What is the experience of being a Latinx or Latin American scholar in the field of communication and media studies? What are the main challenges and opportunities that come with our identities? These are the issues that we'll talk about in El Café Latinx, where some of the leading voices in the field will share their professional experiences. Hola, my name is Pablo Boczkowski. I teach at Northwestern University, where I hold the Hamad bin Khalif Al Thani Chair in Communication. Together with Mora Matassi, doctoral student at Northwestern and executive producer of this podcast, we invite you to discover the journeys of scholars who are at the cutting edge of creating knowledge about Latinx or Latin American communities across the Americas. These are our stories. Esas son nuestras historias. Estas son nuestras historias. Welcome to this new episode of El Café Latinx. I am thrilled to have with me today on the screen my dear friend Sebastián Valenzuela, who is associate professor at the School of Communications at Pontificia Universidad Católica in Santiago de Chile, where he's also director of research. Sebastián is also associate researcher at the Millennium Institute for Foundational Research on Data. He did his undergraduate at Católica, the place where he works now in Chile, and his master and PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. Sebastián is an expert in the areas of political communication, public opinion, journalism studies, new media. He's truly one of the foremost experts in Latin America on all of these topics. He's been incredibly productive. He has 45 journal articles in the leading journals of the field with almost 15,000 citations. He's getting his PhD less than a decade ago. In addition to that, he just published the third edition of Setting the Agenda, the News, Media, and Public Opinion with the legendary Max McCombs, and has received a number of awards, including top citation awards for his research. So, Sebastián, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Pablo, for that presentation. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
It's truly my pleasure. So, Sebastián, how did it all begin? That is, how was the start of the journey that led you to become a professor?
So, I studied journalism as an undergrad, and for 5 or 6 years after graduation, I worked at El Mercurio newspaper here in Santiago, which is this traditional conservative leading daily. And I used to work in the business section. And in the business section, you get to interview many people, of course, including policymakers. And often it would happen that as a journalist, as a reporter, I would be asking the questions. But at some point, I must say, I started to wonder whether I wanted to remain asking questions rather than provide answers to those questions. And it started to happen that actually got tired of asking other people's questions. As I said at some point, I want to be the expert that wants to be interviewed and provide answers. The problem is that when you study journalism, you're not really an expert at anything in terms of a disciplinary field. So I was at was kind of a catch-22. I studied a field, I was doing what I was expected to do, but I wanted to be on the other side of the microphone, if that makes any sense. So naturally, I thought that going to grad school would be kind of a a way of getting away from my job, have a good excuse to get away from a good paying job as a journalist, but kind of reinvent myself. I was going only for a master's. I had no intention of becoming a scholar, as in terms of like a full-time academic. I wanted to be someone who, when I would come back with my degree, I would be able to do some consulting work, or maybe work part-time journalist and part-time something else. But after finishing my first semester in Austin as a master's student, it became readily apparent that I wanted to, this was the life I was looking like. This is the life. Like, there was something called a PhD. I had no idea what a PhD was. And then one thing led to another, and I stayed in the end for 6 years, finishing my master's first and then the PhD.
So why Texas Austin for your master's? What was the journey from Santiago?
Yeah, well, there was one thing I knew for sure. I wanted to do my degree in the US or in Canada, but in North America. That was kind of narrowing down my choices. I didn't want to go to Europe as a student. I thought it was too expensive. And there were more funding opportunities for going to the US. I had a Fulbright scholarship and everything. But then I had to pick a university. And when I was in the process of deciding, Max McCombs came to Chile, invited by, I don't remember who invited him. It was not my university, not Católica, but a foundation invited him, I think, to give a talk or something. And my girlfriend at the time, who's not my girlfriend anymore because it's not my wife now, but my girlfriend at the time, she was working in this organization, and she said, why don't you speak English? Why don't you offer yourself to be a guide tour in Santiago of Max McCombs? And I barely remember his name for a class I took in Intro to Communication Theory as an undergrad on agenda setting. Anyway, Max came. That's how I met him. I met him I was a journalist, and I had the time in a weekend to walk him around, and I had topics in common like news stuff. Anyway, I told him I wanted to study at some point in the US, and he said, why don't you come to Texas? There's a bunch of us who study political communication, and it seems that you would like that. Anyway, that was it. But then when I was applying, Texas was one of my choices. Other universities, they were all located either in California or in the Southern Belt, because one thing I did know was that I didn't want to sustain, to suffer actually the Midwestern winter. So all the universities in the Midwest, including Northwestern, unfortunately, they were to me forbidden. Not because anything of the university, but they said I'm not going to be able to, weather the snow and all that. So that was kind of the whole point. And then I ended in Texas because I was accepted there in other universities, and I knew Max, and Max was like the big scholar, and I said might be smart to work under his, guidance, and that's it. Yeah, and I don't regret it. I had a lot of fun there.
Absolutely. He's a giant, and UT Austin has an incredible program in all things communication related. So how was the experience of being a Latin American student in a US university like UT Austin?
When I did when I started my master's in 2005, I would say that in the communication and in the journalism school in Texas, most of the students were Americans or Asian students, right? There were few Latin American students. So in my department, so in our department, few Latin American scholars. So in a way, that was a different experience to me, because now you would feel like actually a minority, right? But Austin and the university and the city, and for that matter, the state of Texas, they have a huge, influx of immigrants from Latin America, particularly Mexico. And of course, you also have the local Mexican American population. So in that sense, Spanish would be a language, for example, that you would hear everywhere all the time, in the university, outside the university, and when you would move around the city. And in that sense, it made it for a very, I would say, comfortable kind of context. There was a group of South Americans actually in the university that we would get together. They were from different fields, and we would socialize a lot. Like you would see, it was kind of a clique. But I would say that in general, it was a time that was very welcoming. I don't think I experienced during my time there the animosity towards foreigners, for example, that I started to that I felt when I went back to the US in 2018 for a year for my sabbatical in Madison, in Wisconsin. And talking to different colleagues, the question would be, yeah, things have changed here. And in that sense, I look back now and I would say, I didn't feel that. I didn't feel at a time that we were being looked with suspicions, even in a conservative state like Texas. Now, Austin, of course, is kind of a bubble, politically speaking. But even when you would go, up to the countryside, in general, Texans are very welcoming, and you would say that in that sense, my experiences were very positive. The way I remember it. And that's very different from, as I said, when we came back with my whole family to Madison, to Wisconsin. There you would feel, not in the city, of course, but in the state in general, and I would say in the country, kind of a different, something had changed.
Why, first of all, how did that change manifest? And why do you think that's the case? I wonder, what your thoughts are.
I think it's part of the increasing polarization and division that the US has experienced over the past 10 years. I mean, radicalized, of course, after Trump became president. But I would say that there's this general process of divisions, of identities clashing and expressing themselves, and identities that have been hidden in a way, right? Like white nationalism, all that. You thought, or I thought, it was more on the fringes of society. In the American society, they seem not to be that much. And I think in that process of fighting or division, of course, something like being an immigrant or being a foreigner, it's a very salient aspect. It's just a matter of opening your mouth. In my case, right? You would say, "Hi, how are you? Where are you from?" Right? So I think it's in a way, I would say the animus against immigrants is part of this larger process of differentiation and sorting that I think the US has been experiencing. And it's different, of course, when you study it than when you experience it. For example, we were in a supermarket in Madison, and with my wife, and something happened that we had never actually experienced before, which was that we were speaking in Spanish, and then there's this man that approaches my wife, and he just kind of went ballistic. He just started to, scream and, throw insults and stuff. Go back to your country or whatever. And it's kind of what you read in the news, and now it's like, and it's I don't know. I don't know the origins, but I would say it's part of that. He was wearing a red cap. I don't know if the words were there, "Make America Great Again," but it was kind of the profile, right?
I'm sorry to hear about that. I'm not surprised as somebody who's been here and lives here from over a quarter century, but I'm still sorry. Have you seen comparable trends in the field of communication and media studies when you go to conferences? In particular, and in general, what has been your experience as a scholar from Latin America who works in Latin America and whose research is mostly on Latin America? What has been your experience of being part of a global field?
So there's been a very interesting change over this past decade when I graduated and started my career as an assistant professor to the stage where I'm at right now. And it has been, in that sense, a positive experience. When I started my work, when I just came back from the US and I was already finishing the papers I was doing with data collected in the US, but I was starting to collect data here in Chile, for example, and also in Colombia with Hernando Rojas and other friends. When I began doing that work, we had a concern when we were trying to get our work out there, not so much in conference, but more in journals, for example, that we had to, in a way, kind of excuse ourselves for doing our work in Latin America, right? It's like you would see these in a number of ways. It would manifest itself, but one of them would be like having many paragraphs in the paper explaining the context in a way that it's great now that I read it to have a contextualized studies, but it's something that was never asked for people doing work in the global north, right? You would also see it when reviewers, for example, were wondering, that's very interesting. Is it applicable here, right? Like the idea that because you do a study in a particular, it's never applicable. And it's like two extremes. On the one hand, they want you to contextualize everything because it's not applicable anywhere. And then it's like, we don't know the value because maybe it's only applicable to different double standards, right? So we would experience that, I would experience with my co-authors, that idea kind of not so subtle sometimes. But I think after a few years, there's been a very interesting turn in the field, or at least I have experienced that, where actually you start to perceive that the work you're doing is welcome, is actually appreciated and promoted. And this takes, again, many different forms. One of them is like with editors, conferences, reviewers asking for work done in new or marginalized contexts, and that's one way. But also in terms of just appreciating a larger field, like moving the laboratory of available cases to different places. And one last thing, there's this pressure somehow in many countries in the global north to demonstrate some level of internationalization, either because of rankings, because of I don't know what. We've been lucky in a way to be benefited because of that. Like, I'm positive I've been invited to serve in editorial boards, not because of the work I've done in that particular area that merits, but it's more because they found out, the editors, that their editorial board was all based in one country, in two countries they need to expand. And when they're looking for people to invite over, say there's these people from Chile and from Argentina and Colombia, and they open you the door, and then you demonstrate that not only are you doing very relevant and important work, but you also teach them to be more open and more receptive to other works. And I think that's enable kind of a very positive virtuous circle where, of course, differences and double standards might remain, but I would say that the context is much more supportive. And I say this with, after at some, I say this now having experienced it, but I would be inaccurate if I would say that when I graduated and we decided with my wife to move back to Chile and start a career in academia here, that we were not concerned about that. I mean, we thought, even some professors would say, one of them told us, and I'm going to say her name, she said, "Oh, you're going back to Chile, I'm so sorry." Basically saying, we lost you, right? And each day I publish something or I get invited to something, I always think about her and I say, here we are.
Good for you. Now, what you are describing then are two trends that go in a somewhat opposite direction. In the US, and it's probably fair to say in other advanced economies, countries in the global north, there has been an overall trend towards polarization. Great Britain being another case that is obvious with Brexit, and also you see the return of the right in Europe, even in places like Germany. And that comes usually with increasing polarization. Now, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the field becoming perhaps not entirely equitable, but still at least more aware of its own ethnocentrism and trying to some extent, change things. So why do you think society is moving in one direction and the field in another? I'm curious.
That's about an interesting way of putting it. I hadn't thought about it. That they're moving in different directions. I think academia and universities have always been at some point at the vanguard of trends. I think they were giving back in the day room, space for women to get a higher education or to get degrees, to study fields that were only for men before, way before gender equity was an issue in politics, and way before, legalizing women's vote, right? So I don't think in that sense I'm terribly surprised about that, right? On the other hand, particularly in the US, for example, the world usually laughs at Americans' lack of awareness of international trends, about their being so isolated or ethnocentric, right? Everyone, particularly the French, like to make fun of that, right? They're not sophisticated. But see, of course, that's an exaggeration, but I don't think that applied to universities in general. I would say that my experience and the experience my friends from, who have done or worked there that come from different international backgrounds, they have perceived that universities are a very welcoming environment. That's where you find, the most connected or more world-versed Americans are thinking at the universities. So in that sense, I don't think I'm that surprised. And in the end, I think there's another thing. Globalization, part of that, we can talk more, for days about that, but what is globalization? But one thing that is pretty clear is that traveling and learning about different realities is much easier now than before. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, that poses a threat to people who have a more nativistic, outlook, right? But they are nativistic or ethnocentric, not because they're ethnocentric per se. They are as a response to the threat they perceive from being in a more open, globalized world. So maybe it's not despite this ethnocentric turn that, segment of, of the global north has, is turning to. It's not despite that universities are looking, abroad, but it's actually maybe in part of it because of it, right? Anyway, it's something that we need to pay attention to. I would say that I wouldn't confuse the country or the state of the country in general with what happens in universities. I think we are sometimes in different scales. In this sense, in a positive way. I don't think universities have turned, or my experience, with the ones I know in the US, for example, have taken this nativistic, turn that I've seen in parts of, the citizenry.
Okay. And very interesting. So going back to the moment in which you, or the process of going back to Chile after your PhD at UT Austin, did the change in location, you think, affected or shaped or influenced your research program? Choice of topics, methods, questions, issues. I mean, there is the obvious aspect that you are in Chile, so you're collecting Chilean data, for instance, right? But beyond that, do you think, if at all, the location has shaped what you study and how you study it? And if so, in which ways?
No, definitely. And I would say three things. So the first one, it influences the co-authors you have. I've always been of the idea that to succeed in academia, not actually to succeed, to survive in academia, you have to be part of a team. You have to be a teammate, a team member. Doing solo work is not very productive, and actually, particularly in my case, I've never liked it. I only have few solo third pieces just to demonstrate I can do work by myself. But if I can prevent it, I will. So depending on where you are, in this case in Chile, I met new colleagues or I strengthened links with people that I knew before going to grad school or when I was in grad school. And that has an influence because the work you do is not only the work you think, but also the work that you do with the other people, right? So that would be one influence. The second one would be in the kind of topics you decide to do research. When I finished my grad school, of course, I was influenced by what was happening, particularly in the US after the 2008 US election, where everyone was startled with the role that social networks and social media played in that election, and like everyone was starting to do research in this medium. And so when I came back to Chile, I said, okay, we need to do the same. But rapidly, I kind of faced the fact that, of course, social media was important too in Chile, but in different ways, and traditional media remains very important. So it's not my most well-known work, but I did work, for example, in a number of years doing work on TV news and the role of television and stuff that, I wouldn't have conducted research if it wasn't because I was here in Chile and I was perceiving that was important to do. And the third element would be the fact that being in Chile, you have access to resources that you don't have access to in other places, right? Not Chile particularly. I'm saying countries outside, the global north. You have less funding, but more funding. So maybe the number of or institutions providing funding or the amount of funding that they give you compared to what you would get in Europe or in Western Europe or in North America, maybe it's less, but you have more access to it because the pool of people applying to these funds is smaller. So I was able to carry, for example, large-scale surveys that they would have been impossible to conduct in the US just because of a matter of costs and lack of money. And again, as I said, I mean, I would say that third element has played a big part, because I've been able to think about doing projects where the restrictions in terms of funding are very different from my colleagues, people in my cohort, for example, in Texas, then got a job, a tenure track job in the US. And we would have conversations where I would say, what are you doing? I'm doing this study and this. And they would be like, wow, you know, you got money. And it's like, we're not rich, but you can do more with less here, and you have access to it. So that, of course, has influenced a lot, because it depends on the kind of, one example would be, and with this I finish, is that I used to do a lot of secondary analysis when I was a grad student, not only because I was a grad student, because a lot of my professors in the US were doing that. Here, I get to do a lot of original field work. And part of it is because I have funding, access to funding that I would have, and, you know, if I had stayed in the US.
Very interesting. So that's one aspect of academic life. How about working with students? Because not everybody in the US and the global north might be familiar with, for sure you teach classes, which, you know, people do in other countries. But how is the possibility of working with graduate students at Católica and in Chile in general?
Yeah, that's something that, compared to what I was saying in my earlier response, has been kind of a challenge, much more challenging. Usually, because what happens is that the good students, good undergrad students that might, you know, become great grad students, most likely they're going to go abroad to do their grad school work rather than stay in Chile. So we have this situation where, in general, our undergrad students are much better than our grad students, I say, as a country in general, which is kind of interesting. For example, I've done a lot of my research when I have to hire assistants, for example, coders for a content analysis. I hire undergrads rather than grad students. Part of it is because also grad students who stay here in Chile to do their graduate degree, they also have to manage a job or a work. So it's not that they don't have the quality to do, or the capacities, the abilities. It's just that they also don't have the time to do additional work from their coursework, right? So I would say that's kind of the general challenge for, this has been for me, to work with a large group of graduate students. That's kind of the problem you have, that they don't have the time oftentimes to do your work, which is kind of, it sounds crazy, right? I mean, grad students are supposed to work with your professors. They do, but what if you have part-time students, right? And many of them are part-time students. I would say the other challenge, though, is that before 2012, there were no PhD programs in communication in Chile, zero. There were a lot of masters. Ours was the first. So we started in Católica in 2012, and that has been a great experience. It's a very small program. We only admit a few students because we have capacities to train a few of them. But every year we have 4 or 5 incoming students, many of them from other Latin American countries. And that has been great. But it's a new program, 2012. So we have graduate students, I mean, students who have graduated already. But I would say that in 5 to 10 years, that thing is I expect to blow. In the meantime, 2 other universities have created here in Chile PhD programs in communication. So I think we're starting to build, the structure to have a decent grad education in communication. But as I say, it's something we're building. It's part of the thrills, but also the challenges of being based here in Chile.
Sure. So what's the labor market for these graduates? So do they go work in academia in Chile? Do they go work in academia elsewhere? Do they work in the public sector, in the private sector?
So most of them actually go to work in academia, but because half of them usually are from countries outside Chile, they go back to their home country and work in the universities there. The rest, those who stay here in Chile, usually are students who are starting their careers as part-time lecturers or adjuncts, professors or something. Then they want to go up in the ladder of tenure and so forth. But the universities where they work, which tend to be small private universities or public universities that are located in outside Santiago, so in more peripheral cities, they ask these students to, okay, if you get your PhD, then we're gonna, offer you either a full-time position or something. So far, I would say those who stay in Chile, all of them, after graduation, have gone back to work in academia. But there's an interest recently, we started to perceive an interest of people applying for the PhD program to work also in the private sector or in the public sector. Private sector meaning for example, they already work in a big advertising agency and they're working in the research marketing area of the agency, but they don't have the knowledge and they think that maybe a PhD, not that they have been applying or showing some interest, but we have to sort it out because in the end, it's also a program of 4 years. And it might be sometimes complicated for them to be on leave for 4 years and then go back. And then we have one former student who actually works in the public sector. He did his PhD and then he works in communications, but in an agency in the government. Yeah, but so, most of them academia. Yeah.
So is the program funded? So do they get funded by scholarships?
Yeah. So the Chilean government through the CONICET, well, now they changed the name of the agency. Now it's called ANID. Well, the national scientific body, they fund scholarships for doing PhDs here in Chile and also abroad, Prof, if you stay in Chile. So I would say half of our students get this funding from this national body. And then for those who don't, the university provides partial funding. Unfortunately, we don't have the funds to give them like full funding. So some of them, particularly those students who don't get fully funded, they have to do some kind of part-time work. Sometimes we hire them again in our research projects, but it's not as settled the system as it is at least in Research One universities in the US that I know. It's not like the number of students you accept depends on the funding, and if you are accepted, these are the conditions. It's like it's more variable here. It's like some years all are funded, other years not so much, and yeah, so it varies.
But it's a new institution, so to speak, so it's bound to change most likely.
Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of in the making, everything, a lot of it. But we have the experience of a lot of the people who run these programs have been trained abroad and know how it works. So at least we kind of agree where it should go, right? But often the problem, as I say, is that students actually, for example, either they can't or they don't want to be full-time students. They want to be part-time students. So some of them might have the expectation of doing a PhD, but they have kind of the mindset of doing a master's. And that's not really it. So, explaining that and justifying, like, why do you need to do a program for 4 or 5 years? It's been sometimes, kind of a work of getting people to better understand the nature of a PhD. This is not like a master's program on steroids. It's a different thing, right?
Okay. Now, we've talked about your own career. We've talked about your experience in the US, going back to Chile. We've talked about the field and your experience of the field changing over time and your experience being part of an institution in the making, right? So taking into account the spectrum of things that we talked about, if you have magical powers and could be granted one wish about something that you would like, for it to change, either in the field of communication and media studies, maybe in the field in Chile, what would that be? What would you wish for?
If I would get magical powers. So I was thinking about this question when I was listening to another podcast of yours with Hernando Rojas, and the one thing that came to my mind was that we're still wrestling as communication scholars here in Chile, in the US, elsewhere, with the kind of an identity crisis. We think that we need to validate ourselves as a field with the other social sciences. We debate between ourselves about what is communication, what it's not. Our good friend Silvio Weisberg wrote and published a superb book on this, like the idea of communication, a post-discipline. But if I would have the magic wand, I would say somehow we become into agreement of what we are and what we are not, or maybe we come into agreement that we don't need to care about what we are. But I would say that in a way, I would like for us to be recognized by funding bodies, by the other social sciences as a social science by itself. And that everyone recognizes what you do when you say you are a communication scholar, which is something that I have to wrestle every day. It's like my friends who are political scientists, oh yeah, political scientists, those who are economists, oh, of course. Yeah. Sociologists even. And then you say communication is like, it makes sense. So what do you do? Why do you need a PhD in communication? And when you talk with a more learned audience, say NGOs, think tanks, foundations and stuff, you might get sometimes, questions about like, are you incorporating in your group for your proposal, people from the hard sciences or the social, kind of saying, you guys communication, I don't really know what you guys do. And you're not validated in a way, right? Like what you do. So I would say that would be great. And I think part of it is not because others don't recognize, but because we, as I said, we have kind of an identity crisis. We don't really know what we do. I mean, we know what we do in our very defined, niche field, but there's not an agreement, for example, of like, not even the names of the institutions we work. Are we a school of communication, communications and media, communications and journalism? Journalism, we don't even agree upon a name. And that's fine. We all have personal opinions about what we should do, that we need to wrestle with this complexity. I'm not arguing against, the merits of one proposal or the other. What I'm arguing is like, have a magic wand to everyone agrees what it is, and we move over that, and everyone recognizes this field, and we move on. We move on as a well-defined, and we are perceived as relevant as other fields and all that. That would be something that would be applicable not only here in Chile or in Latin America or in the US, but it would be like worldwide. That when people say, are you going to the International Communication Association's annual meeting, they say, you don't get the question, what do you do there? What's that? You know, that would be my wish.
That would be your wish. So let me follow up quickly on that. So what you're describing is a if I may rephrase it, a constant crisis of self-worth, right?
That's a good way of putting it.
Okay, so it seems to be less about what this is, and perhaps together with that, or even more so, what is it worth for, right? So do you see that, since you've had the advantage of, being in the South, but you are part of the North, and you are a very, very well-cited and prominent scholar who travels constantly, and have you hold important positions like in Social Science One. You are the head of the Latin American component of that. So do you think that crisis of self-worth is equally prominent in the South and in the North? More of the North, more of the South? What's your take on that?
If you attend my faculty meetings, you would be in agreement with me that it's everywhere. It's the same.
Okay.
I was lucky enough to participate in faculty meetings when I was in Wisconsin, and the kind of conversations we had there that I heard, actually, because I was kind of more of a witness than a participant, would be very similar to the kind of conversation we have about this topic here in Chile. And it manifests, again, in so many ways in terms of the things we think that ought to be taught to our undergrad students, or the emphasis of our grad program. When we need to hire a new colleague, what kind of colleague are we going to hire? If anything, I wouldn't say it's different in terms of the amount of, or how salient this debate is. It might take particular forms here in this part of the world that is different from your part of the world. But I would say it's pretty universal, I would say. One example, journalism, right? So everyone talks about the future of journalism. Is it journalism? Is it information? Is it the other day I was reading on Twitter, Jay Rosen saying that he was in disagreement with most journalists who say that what defines the profession is storytelling. He said, I can find 5 or 6 different traits that are more important than storytelling, like fact checking. And it was so funny because I was reading Jay Rosen, whose audience is New York or news-oriented people, or right, in the US, or newsgrid, or future of journalism types, right? And that same day, I had a discussion in faculty council. It was about the future of journalism. What is it? Storytelling? No, it's not. I don't know if they had read also Jay Rosen, but I did, and it was like very different universes at the same time were the same problem, right? And that's only with journalism. I mean, expanded to communication in general. But it's, as I said, it's interesting because that hasn't prevented the field from being much more important now than it was before. It's like I'm part of an institute that has a very awkward name, Foundational Research on Data. But basically, I'm going to tell you what it is. It's a bunch of computer scientists who are interested in understanding social media and social networks in general, and data privacy and those sorts of issues. And in computer science, we're limited to understand these society-wide phenomenon. And and they invited a group of social scientists to join them, and they invited us. And it's interesting because it used to be that us in the humanities or in the social sciences, we would be inviting, the hard sciences to help us in doing something. And it's now completely the other way around. So even if we have these debates, that doesn't mean that we are more prominent now than before. And I think the development of technologies and all that has helped a lot to put our field kind of a more fashionable field. But I think there's a problem when that attention paid to the field, people who don't know the field, they invite us, and then they start to figure out that we have all sorts of disagreements and all sorts of identity crisis. Oh, I'm a journalist. No, I'm not a journalist. I'm a rhetorician. And I'm like, okay, but like we don't even know what to teach. We don't even have a canon. It's like political scientists do have a canon. Oh, I'm a comparativist. Oh, I'm a theorist. And we're not that, because we're not even a discipline. We are a bunch of different disciplines. But anyway, I think you get the point. So I think it's a worldwide phenomenon. There's crisis.
All right. And on that, we are going to bring this episode of El Café Latinx to an end. Thank you so much, Sebastián, for an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for our listeners, for staying with us. And I invite everybody to join us for the next episode of El Café Latinx. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo.
El Café Latinx is a production of the Center for Latinx Digital Media in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. I am Pablo Boczkowski, your host, and I'm joined by executive producer Mora Matassi.